the legal authorities, it was the absence of the supervision and discipline in the family that was the major predictor of being involved in criminal behavior. And that was done in England in 1980. Most of you weren't born yet. But many studies since then have continued to find all kinds of evidence for the negative effects of a father being absent. And the first and primary kind of evidence is that boys who grow up without fathers are very much more likely to be involved in criminal activity, and in particular to end up in prison. This has been so well established in this country, in Britain, in Europe, and now around the world in the subsequent decades from 1980, that it's one of the best established findings in social psychology, maybe the most reliable finding. Boys without fathers tend to be involved in criminal activity. In addition, boys without fathers tend to be involved in drugs, which is partly a criminal activity, but it's a special kind of activity that they get often involved in, very commonly. Now, I want to put this in some context. In the United States now, we have, I believe, the largest prison population of any country in the world. There's some evidence that we have the largest proportion of people in prison of any country. Let's not whether those statistics are exactly true or not. We do know we have a large prison population. And we also know that it's been clearly established that in a way our prisons have become warehouses for fatherless boys. A friend of mine who was working in a prison ministry type of setting made sure that all of the prisoners, they were young prisoners, would send a Mother's Day card to their mother. And about 80% of them, or 90%, did that. And then when Father's Day came, he had them do the same thing. Almost none of them knew the address of their father, were in contact with him in any way. Now we have to remember what this means socially. Look at that cost. We have this huge prison population of boys. What does it cost? First, it costs the cost of the crime itself. Second, it costs the cost of the police involvement with this, the number of police officers and time spent arresting and taking care of the crime. Third, it involves the cost of the judiciary system. The judiciary system's involvement in this, the amount of time spent with, trials, all the rest of it involved in making sentences, parole, all of that. Fourth, it involves the cost of housing of these mostly young men for any number of years. And it costs to house a young man in prison about the same price as it would to send that boy to a private boarding school. It's costly, maybe $20,000 a year, $15,000, $20,000 a year. Maybe that's a cheap boarding school now, I don't know. I haven't kept up. And finally, the most significant cost of all is it costs millions of boys, young men, their lives being blighted. All those years lost, and with the record that they have. This is a really important place for positive action to occur, which needs to be done. All right, so that tells you something about the cost of it. Let me go into some more of the studies here. By the way, in the absence of fathers and the effect of it on boys being caught up in criminal behavior is now beginning to show on the effects of daughters or of girls who are also without fathers, something of a growth in criminal behavior with young girls as well, also from similar backgrounds. In Germany, they found, for example, that father absence was associated with not only juvenile violence, but also with right-wing radical groups in German culture. In general, radical politics on both sides of the spectrum seems to draw from the population of boys and without fathers. I've mentioned the importance of drugs also being involved in many of the cases of criminal behavior. I don't know where to stop on all of this. For example, children without fathers have lower IQs, lower cognitive functioning. They're more likely to have asthma. The infants are more likely to die in the first year. There are all kinds of negative effects when the father is absent that impact the mother and his children. One of the characteristics of father absence is many more emotional and depression problems, as well as behavioral problems. Depression is possibly increasing there's some evidence that depression is increasing in our culture among young people. Recent studies have shown that, along with suicide also increasing. Whether this is related to fatherless families or not, I don't know. But there would be reason. We already know that fatherless families are much more likely to have depressed and other behavioral problems in their children. Depression. Fatherless children are more likely to drop out of school. They're more likely to remain poor, less likely to get jobs and be employed, and less likely to move up from the lowest 20% of Americans in income to the highest. One of the reasons that there's been a lot of success in the Asian community is that, relatively speaking, fathers are more present in the Asian families than in the rest of American culture. And one of the consequences of that is that some of these very poor Asian immigrants are moving up very rapidly and very successfully. By the way, if you want the references, I've got a whole bunch of them, and I can give them to you afterwards in a number of ways, either name it for you or take your name and send you this paper by email. One of the things that we forget is that the psychological importance of the father is the impact is on the children. And one of the problems with adults is they're not so good at noticing the impact sometimes on their children. And this seems to be a little bit truer of men than of their mothers, not noticing what their emotional impact really is. But in some of the studies, for example, on divorce with fatherless children, some of the most important ones done by Wallerstein and others, the children who felt commonly what happens is the father will leave the family and the mother will stay often in the same place and with the children. Whether they stay in the same place or not, usually the children do remain with the mother. And here's a quote from Wallerstein. The children who felt rejected by the father were burdened in their psychological functioning despite the presence of a good mother. Good father-child relationships appeared linked to high self-esteem and the absence of depression in children of both sexes and of all ages. 2/3 of the children, especially the younger children, yearned for the absent parent, usually the father, 1/2 of them with an intensity which we found profoundly moving. The effect of this, in the case of divorce, is found on men ages 24 to 70 who had absent fathers. already it's still found much longer in their lives than anyone would have thought, up to age 70. In support of this, I quote from a well-known liberal anthropologist, Margaret Mead. And here's what she wrote in 1949. One of the most important learnings for every human child is how to be a full member of its own sex and at the same time fully relate to the opposite sex. It is not an easy learning. It requires the continuing presence of a father and a mother. One of the things that was found in a whole set of studies that were done across cultures around the world was that children were happier in families where the father was regularly in the family. And second, that the mothers did better mothering when the father was present. And I mentioned this to my wife. By the way, we have 6 children and 22 grandchildren, so I've seen a lot of families, just in my own immediate environment, much less others. And she said, well, of course, if the father's around, not only do you have another person that helps, another adult, which always, 2 adults always help, but the morale of the mother goes up. She feels supported. She feels that child rearing is important. She doesn't let the absence of the father make her feel that taking care of the children was a rump activity that she was just dumped on with. The father's presence brings up her morale. And so even the quality of mothering was better in those societies where the father was regularly there. There are even a few studies, most studies show the mother's greater importance and involvement. But there are some studies that have shown also that the father's involvement was of greater significance for the emotion of the children. All of those that did find the father's greater significance were focused, to the best of my memory now, on effects that were measured in children when they were somewhat older. The effects of fathers seem to come in more after the child is 5 or 6, something like that, the major effects. They come in when the father becomes somebody who introduces the child to the outside world often in some way, whether it's at the office or playing chess or bird watching or whatever. Not many bird watchers here, huh? Okay. One of the things that's really quite important is that the father seems to be significant, especially with sons, at developing impulse control. And here I want to mention, you don't have to be, you can be a truck driver, and here's how it would go. The 14-year-old boy starts being smarty to his mother. And the father says, shut up. Shut up or you're grounded. Or maybe even says, shut up or I'll smack you. That's my wife. That's your mother. But men have 2 great motives they've got to learn control with respect to. One is aggression, and the other is sex. And at least with respect to aggression, and by the way, the 2 are sometimes tied together psychologically, in fact, often. They need to learn to control aggression. And the fact that they haven't is why these statistics come out on so many young men who, without fathers, getting involved in criminal behavior. And by the way, most of our crime is committed by young men and boys between the ages of about 16 and 30 or 28. Recently I saw, is the murder going to disappear in America as we get older? Very few murderers are 40 and older. So this impulse control, we're not quite sure how it takes place, but when the truck driver father says, "Shut up," with a voice like that, that does it. Don't talk to your mother like that. But there's an interesting animal study that's related to this. There's a very large natural history or natural science park in South Africa. And for some reason, they decided to they had a large elephant herd. And for some reason, they decided to take a large number of male elephants, young male elephants, and put them in part of the park by themselves. So basically, you had all these teenage elephants in one part of the park. And they noticed that these elephants became enormously aggressive. And they started killing the rhinos. And the park was partly set up to protect rhinos as well as elephants. And so this was very disturbing to them. They had never seen this behavior before. And one park ranger had the bright idea, well, let's take some of the older bulls from the main group and put them in here. And they did that, and within a few months, the aggression level of those young males had dropped way down. Now, I don't think those older bull elephants said, "Shut up," or "I'll whop you," or something like that. No, but somehow or other, the presence of older males is a way of allowing men to learn how to control aggression, and I expect also, in most cases, sexuality. In fact, if I wanted to summarize this, I could take a little quote from a talk by, of all people, Barack Obama. And so I'll just summarize some of his remarks. And he doesn't give the references for his statistics. If anything, his statistics are more extreme than mine. But I wonder where he got them. I'd like to find them. But anyway, here's what Obama said, and you can find it online, about fathers. Of all the rocks upon which we build our lives, we are reminded today that family is the most important. And we are called to recognize and honor how critical every father is to that foundation. They are teachers and coaches, they are mentors and role models. They are examples of success and the men who constantly push us toward it. We know the statistics that children who grow up without fathers are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. So, this is a very brief summary of father absence effects, the negative effects. And I now want to talk a little bit about what are the theoretical reasons for these, that is, the psychological reasons for it. As I said, one, the fathers are a primary source of self-control and self-regulation. I knew that when I was a child, a long time ago. Dad would be at work, and my mother would sometimes, we'd do things that would make her angry and upset, and she had a hard time punishing us. But the way she would punish us, she'd say this: when your father comes home, I'm going to tell him. So we knew. So impulse control, self-control. And self-control is an extraordinarily important virtue. Psychology has just recently discovered the importance of the virtues in the last 20 years. My Dominican friends laugh at me when I mention that. After 2,500 years, psychology has discovered the virtues. Yes, but I tell my Dominican friends, but you've told us about them for 2,500 years, ever since Aristotle, but nobody's paid any attention. And we didn't know what to do with them. And psychology is discovering if you can teach them, and if so, how and when. And one of the major virtues they've discovered is self-control. And it's very, very important they're now finding evidence that self-control is as important for good grades for, these are middle school kids, as IQ. The kid who was bright, who came home, who couldn't control himself, and he had to watch TV right away, didn't do very well. The kid with the same IQ or a lower one who came home and had self-control and do his homework first, got ahead, got better grades. Self-control is one of those virtues that's at the foundation of later virtues. You can't be brave, you can't have courage without self-control. You have to control your fear. Bravery is not being afraid. If you're not afraid, you're just being reckless and it's all fun or something, I don't know. But self-control means you can control your fear. Justice, to show justice to other people, you have to control your self-interest. If you're going to show prudence or wisdom, you have to control anger and all sorts of other impulses, and so on. Self-control is therefore a kind of transitional, functional virtue for all the great virtues. And fathers are very important at the development of that, particularly with boys. Second, fathers are a source of gender identity, especially for boys. Gender identity is a complicated question, but boys have more trouble trying to find out what the meaning of gender is, on average, than girls. Girls can look up and see their mother, and they know their gender is pretty directly in front of them from the time they're born. But for boys, oh, your dad's at the office. What does that mean? The office? Most of us don't even have a concrete image of an office. And if we do, it's probably something we don't like. But in any case, boys have more of a problem with gender identity. And the presence of a father is very important for that. And what's interesting is the studies have shown that the property of the father that's most important is the affection he has for the children. It's not whether the father was a football player or a basketball player and very successful in some masculine activity. What counts is whether the father was affectionate and supportive and loving toward the child, toward the boy. Besides gender identity, all children also face another basic issue, and this is called separation and individuation. And fathers are especially helpful for girls in terms of separation and individuation. Why? Girls are, from the very beginning, there's lots of evidence, they're more interpersonal than boys. They respond earlier to a face and to smiles, they smile more. They're much more interested in people in general. And one of the sometimes difficult problems for a daughter is that she can almost merge with her mother. And the father allows the child to separate and individuate more easily. Particularly in the teenage years, sometimes mothers and daughters have a difficult relationship. May be familiar to you or some of your friends. If the father is present, it allows the daughter to talk to somebody else who knows everything that's going on and who is loving of the mother, and therefore it's not a betrayal or anything of that kind, and allows the daughter to separate from the mother. It also allows the mother to be less emotionally involved with her children, to be too attached to the children, and to start having the child be a substitute father or a substitute therapist or something of that kind. It gives them a safe but present adult so that maybe a father-daughter dance or something like that can symbolize it. There's lots of evidence that girls who grow up without fathers are more sexually active, and their period comes earlier in life. They have an earlier menarche. Something about biological fathers is it's less sexual. It's less of that kind of a thing. So, although separation and individuation is also a difficult task for boys, it seems to be more difficult for girls. And gender identity seems to be more difficult for boys, although in some ways it can be difficult at times for girls too. But the father is a very important mediator of those two transitional issues. Another thing that's been found, this is a fourth thing, is that fathers are especially important in the passing on of religion. That when the father disparages religion and doesn't respect it or doesn't address it and represent it in a positive way, one of the consequences is that the children think religion isn't important either. Now, mothers can sometimes compensate for that, and we all know of examples where mothers have been very helpful, and they are. But on average, and we're talking about averages here where there's overlap, of course, on average, fathers are more important in passing on the religious beliefs and tradition of the family. So those are four things in which fathers are especially important. Impulse control, gender identity, especially for boys, separation, individuation, especially for daughters, passing on the religion and traditions of the family. Now, I want to move back from the psychological evidence and consider some other issues related to it. If you read the Old Testament, one of the things that's interesting about it is they often refer to the sins of the fathers being passed on 1, 3, maybe even 7 generations. These old patriarchs never referred to the sins of the mothers. Very curious indeed, right? Why might that be? All right, I'm proposing a solution, or an answer to it anyway. First of all, I think mothers, on average, are much more reliable at being good mothers than fathers are at being good fathers. Second, if a mother is not a good mother, it shows very early in the interaction with the infant, usually. And substitute mothers come in quickly. You know, a sister, a grandmother, some other woman sees, hey, the kid's going to die, or he's crying all the time, what's the matter? So they substitute mothers usually get there much right in time. And third, if you really do have bad mothering, rare as it is, but let's say you had a crack mother or a schizophrenic mother and nobody was around to intervene on a positive way, then the person is likely to grow up so mentally, shall we say, harmed, deformed, or depressed, lonely, isolated, whatever, that they can't cause trouble for the society. They can cause trouble maybe for their immediate members of their family or people who know them. But they're not going to function very well because they've been so emotionally blighted. Because it's in the emotional realm that mothers are so good at raising children most of the time. But if you have a decent mother but a bad father, then you can go out and you're going to be emotionally okay, but you can get rid of your anger by causing trouble in the society. And so right now we recognize that in our culture, the sins of the fathers have passed on a lot of our criminal behavior and a lot of other problems in our society. And so I think it's time that we recognize, that men recognize how important fatherhood is, and step up to the plate. Now, there is some evidence that this is beginning to happen in a modest way, but it has to be done more seriously. Otherwise, we have the following. At present, we sort of have two models of what it is to be a man. One we'll call the macho model, and we all know what that one is. That's where a man uses all of his strength and ability and energy and so forth to look out for himself. He exploits others for whatever he can get and looks out for number one. Well, this model, the macho model, has been criticized by feminists and many others. And in fact, the criticisms are mostly just. Then comes along the second model. For a while, there was the model that I called the wimpo model, not the macho model. The wimpo he's nice and androgynous, and he's fun to go shopping with. But he can't commit himself either. He can, just like the macho man is committed to himself and cannot commit to another, the wimpo man is so weak or so narcissistic or so involved in his own psychology that he can't commit either. And it doesn't take long before the women notice this and find it equally disturbing. So the answer to this has got to be something in between, but where the man understands that if you're going to be a father, you're going to have to make sacrifices. It ain't a cheap accomplishment. And you have to be willing to do that. We'll get back to that in a minute. I want to mention now a famous model of the wrong kind. We all have seen, I believe, James Bond movies. Now, I've sort of laughed and enjoyed them to some extent as much as anybody. But let's face it, James Bond was a man without any bonds with anybody. James Bond had no family, he had no wife, he had no children. And what did he do? All he did was what a macho does. Kills bad guys, and it was always clear he knew who the bad guy was, and the movie made sure you knew it too. In real life, it's not so clear who the bad guys are. And then he always woke up afterwards, in bed with the beautiful Russian spy, or Pussy Galore, or somebody like that. So it was sex and violence. No commitments to anybody. He's the man without bonds, in spite of his name. And so it's with these bonds and commitments that men have to confront being a father. And this means sacrifice. And why do you think mothers are so reliably loved? Well, a lot of reasons, of course, but one of the reasons is everybody knows they sacrifice things for their children, for you. They've sacrificed for you. Now, what does a mother sacrifice? Well, I don't know when it begins, maybe with morning sickness, but mothers sacrifice sleep, time, all kinds of things for their children. And this is why they're honored. It's because they sacrifice. Now, for men, there is a tradition of sacrifice and honor, but it's not with fathers. It's in the military. In the military, the soldier who sacrifices his life or his body, in some sense getting wounded, for his comrades is honored. And in most cases, the highest award, the Medal of Honor, goes to the man who died for his buddies. So sacrifice still is recognized there, male sacrifice, as something of value, and something, in fact, of high value, highest value. But fathers also make sacrifices, and that's the thing you're going to have to do with the commitment. There are all kinds of sacrifices you'll make. You may end up not getting promoted so much and making so much money. Obviously, you have to say no to sexual temptations. Hopefully, that's not too much of a sacrifice, but, Some men seem to think it is. But you'll have to sacrifice your time spent with them, other things. And you'll have to take the risk of suffering. And that's the thing about commitment to any other person. To your wife and to your children, you take the risk of suffering. Why? Because something might happen to them. They might die. Or they might get sick. Or they might abandon you. You have to take that risk. And be prepared to take the sacrifice. But that's the one way that a man can become a man. Just like a woman becomes a woman by taking, in motherhood. And I don't mean all women have to be natural mothers. Mother Teresa of Calcutta was not a natural mother. And we all know women who had no children, but who were very maternal and helpful and supportive in ways that was wonderful. And not all men have to be natural fathers. We have some priests here in the audience. But you have to be a mentor, and you have to be willing to make sacrifices for others. And if there's any answer to what is called toxic masculinity in our culture today, it's because men have forgotten that they need to sacrifice something besides their, prime ego. And instead of living by it all the time, they have to sacrifice some of that ego for others. But that's the highest form of human being, a man who has sacrificed for others. We might even know a religious figure who exemplified that. And so I end by saying, if we want to get out of this bind of men in some ways exploiting others and now often exploiting women, men have to rediscover that the meaning of all good life is to sacrifice for others, and for men that means the role of being a father. So I hope all you young men in some way see yourself in the future as being a father, a biological father, a spiritual father, a mentor, or something of that kind. Thank you. Q&A.
Thank you, Professor
At least
Vitz.
questions.
It's our tradition at the Humanities Forum to have the students have the first question. So would someone like to, I have a student who would like to ask Professor Vitz an opening question? Anybody? Yeah.
There must be some questions
this young man
with
here.
all these students.
Can you use the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Mic check. Is this good? Okay. So you touched on it briefly, and I'm not sure how much it has to do entirely with the talk, but the question came to mind in terms of the racial dynamic of fatherhood, the incarceration rate. The majority are Black and Latino men, and oftentimes that has to do with fatherlessness, and oftentimes they are fathers.
Right.
So I just wonder if you could touch upon like the racial dynamics that goes on.
How the racial thing, I think, is accidental, because it's now showing up the same thing in white communities, rural communities, where the absence of work and for many white men has led to a really low marriage and fathers being present rate, and all of a sudden the criminal rate is happening there. It is not a racial thing at all. In most integrative cultures, wherever they are, tribal and so on, the kind of juvenile violence that is present here is not present there. It would be very harmful for their cultures, and they've taken care of it in various ways by giving mentors. I think what a program that might help here, a lot of these men, you're not going to say, oh, you got to get married and have family. No, they're not going to do that. That's not quite where to begin, I don't think. But I think if you could find a program where you could pay older men Some of the best substitute fathers in the African American community and parts of Latinos are coaches. And they're good substitute fathers. And boys do respond to substitute fathers quite well. And so if you could get a way to support mentors of all kinds in those communities, I think it would reduce the criminal rate and increase the flourishing of the young men there significantly. But there's no evidence. I mean, as I said, we found it with elephants. There's no evidence that it really has any ethnic basis. In Germany now, as I said, some of the problems with the right-wing kids are coming from the same abandonment of fathers. So it seems to be sort of a universal way in which boys learn to control violence and the impulse to it through having older men around, giving them both advice on something more positive to do and also disciplining them if they start being too aggressive.
Another question.
Other questions? There's one.
Excuse me. Yes, sir.
So, like, with the rise of new technology, how do you think temptations have like changed the new generation, and like how has that new temptation like changed fatherhood as a whole?
I couldn't quite get what that was. Could you?
So like with the new technology that the new generation has, how do you think that has changed like temptations as a whole, and do you think that has like any effect on like the new generation of like fatherhood?
Do I think that the new technology has affected my understanding of fathers and their contributions?
Well, like has it had any effect on it so far?
Has it? Well, I think one of the worst effects that the new technology has facilitated is the easy access to pornography. And I think that withdraws men from commitment to women and idealizing certain sexual notions and so on. But as to whether it has a deeper effect, I don't know. Let me put it this way. There's a very big topic that your question touches on, at least in my judgment, and that is what's going on today with respect to people's finding an identity. Why is identity such an issue today? And I do think technology has had an impact there. But that's a big separate topic, if you'll pardon me saying so, and I sort of don't want to go into why identity is such an issue today. But you are right in your intuition, I think, from your question, that this might have an impact on men understanding what it is to be a father. It would at least mean, because of technology, they can get a lot of different examples that normally wouldn't have been available in a more stable environment. But the real answer to this, in my judgment, is that as I'm beginning, men step up to the plate and start showing they can be fathers. I'll tell you this, 1950, is my mic still on?
Yeah.
Okay. In 1950, all of this wasn't present. Men knew they were going to have to be supportive of, they knew they were going to be fathers, they knew they had to be self-controlled, they knew they had to have, there was still the notion of a man had to be a gentleman in some sense. But the sexual revolution destroyed that and turned us into men who only seemed to be involved in sex and aggression. And it's on the left and on the right. All you have to do is look at left and right ads and advertisements on the internet, and they all have each side has plenty of sexual implications. And go look at this, and go look at that, and go look at this. Who's, here's some lady with a big bust. Don't you want to see further? That type of thing. And it's on the right and on the left. It's just ridiculous. So I think the sexual revolution has been the major destroyer of the positive image of men. New questions? There's one right back there.
Are there any more students who want to ask a question?
Oh, there are plenty.
Oh, there
There's
are.
one, but
Can I pause
we
you,
don't have
please?
to be just students and just non-students.
What? You have a question.
How does your research and your findings kind of tie into modern day families such as same-sex marriages that consist of two mothers and raising children without a father? Just wanted to clarify.
The question is, how does this relate to same-sex marriage? And in particular, the more common one is two mothers. There are sometimes two fathers. That's much less common. But first, let me say this. I'm going to talk to this psychologically. That question has a theological rationale. It has a philosophical rationale. I'm going to talk to it psychologically. First, there isn't enough good research yet. There's research coming out on these on the possible meaning of this. But I would say this, that if it's two mothers, they need to find substitute fathers, substitute males for their children, because you can't grow up ignorant in any close sense of the half of the human race. And so they don't have to, that doesn't mean they need a grandfather, an uncle, they need a brother, somebody where if they have a child, boy or girl, where that child gets experience with the opposite sex. That, I would say, is needed. And the same with two fathers. You better get your mother in there, or your sister in there, or somebody. But that child each child needs to have experience as a child with the opposite sex. And whether such marriages are correct or right or something like that, that is a theological and a philosophical thing. But psychology is, you can say two things. There isn't enough research done to show what are the effects of this, good, bad, or indifferent. But in any case, the research that I cite argues that even when you have two mothers, you better find some father substitutes to come in. And even if you have two fathers, you better find some mother substitutes to come in. Imagine a boy who grew up with never knowing anybody like a woman up close. Women are mysterious enough without having any early experience with them, and men are sort of strange enough for any girl growing up and wonder, beards and all of these things. I agree. That they need to have experience. I would say in both cases, they need to have some early experience and hopefully positive, reliable, regular experience with the opposite sex. That's what this psychology would say.
Okay, thanks. How about another question from a student here?
We had a question over here. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So since he talked about the effects of the absence of a father on a child, what are the effects if the father's present but the mother is absent?
All right, that's another good question. What are the effects of mother absence? Fortunately or unfortunately, that's so rare we don't have research on it. But there is some evidence, I believe, this is a couple of both women psychologists have proposed to me that one of the things that's happening in the recent years is a mother absence. And it's not the mother being totally absent, but being absent a lot and the kids in daycare. And you may know that the average college freshman now is more depressed and more mentally unhappy, and it's gone up every year since they started measuring it in the 70s. And it could be, both these female psychologists suggested they think it's a relative absence of mothers in the lives of their children. Not that they're completely gone, but an absence of that kind of wonderful comfort and support and enthusiastic yes for you that comes only in some way from a mother. And that would be my answer to your question as best as I could say. There aren't many studies of mother absence. When there are some recently that are somewhat related, but these are mothers who are drug addicts, and they're absent, but very frequently a grandmother steps in. One of the things that has been underappreciated has been the historic role of grandmothers, truly serving as mothers for many children. Very good questions, all of them. Another one over there? Remember, even if we have a gray hair, we're still students.
I know exactly who I'm going to give the microphone to here.
Okay, thank you. Are there no students who are eager? If not, I'll ask the question. Not all parents, not all fathers are good fathers. I'm not going to focus on the lurid stuff, sexual abuse and so on. I'm interested rather in the fathers seem to have a capacity to reject their children that mothers don't. A father can say, you're no son of mine, you're no daughter of mine, far more easily than a mother. We could talk, first of all, is that true? I'm not the psychologist. And secondly, it does raise the question, at what point no father is better than a bad father, and how do you decide that point?
Okay. Well, the second question was about what about bad fathers? And bad fathers are probably worse than no father. I've done a lot of research on bad fathers in respect to the origin of atheism, but today, the typical bad father today just leaves. In the past, it wasn't so easy, so sometimes they stayed around. And one of the things I know of one famous intellectual who, Edmund Burke, who had a sort of difficult relationship with his father, but he had an uncle that he spent summers with who was a very good father and who he said was the best man he ever knew. So substitute fathers can help when there's a bad father. Now, your first question, can you state it again for me?
It seems to me that fathers are much more able to reject their children than mothers. Is that true? And if so, why?
It is true, in part because, as they say, you never know who the father is for sure. The mother, you know who the mother is. You don't always know who the father is. And some of the recent DNA tests that people have been engaging in people have discovered that who they thought their father was not their actual father. I don't know what this does in a family when they discover the DNA of the child has nothing to do with the DNA of the father. But anyway, this is one issue. I have nothing more to say about it than that I agree it's an issue. I know nothing about its significance psychologically.
Can we have one more question? One more question? Okay.
There are a couple here.
Sorry.
Oh, over there? No, they were up here.
Oh.
Anyway,
Yeah,
we
hang
got
on.
time for.
We got time. We'll ask two more.
If the father is present, does he have to be involved?
He should be to some significant degree. He may be involved in different things, but he has to show affection for his children. That usually means involvement. A distant father who's sort of present but neither sort of neutral, that's diluting this potential positive significance of the father.
All right. So you stated that girls without fathers are more sexually active, and I was wondering if the same is true for boys without a father, or does it have to do with
I don't know anything about that. I mean, I don't know of any research on it. I suspect it's true, you know. I suspect it's true, but I don't know, I'm ignorant of any research that shows it. Girls do, it is clear that sometimes girls who are without fathers, in fact fairly often, are sexually active earlier. As I said, they get their periods earlier. And sometimes it's a searching for a father figure or for affirmation from a male, which they never got from their father. And so they go out and they find, there's a 14-year-old girl and they find this 18-year-old boy and he's not really going to be a reliable father figure at all. But they get attached and before you know it, she's pregnant and so on. But, and he maybe runs off someplace. So it would be interesting to do the research on that. I suspect that's the case, but it's been demonstrated with a good number of studies with young women. By the way, it's quite possible that that question that was raised in the back there about fathers being able to reject their children because of uncertainty about paternity, that may have a lot to do with why many cultures have valued virginity. That it more or less means that, you know, it's an index of not just purity and but of absence of vulnerability to other men.
Dr. Vitz, I'm the father of 3 children, 12, 10, and 9. Give me advice. How?
Oh, should I start the clock?
No, no. You can be brief. How should a father demonstrate affection to his children? Is there any way that you could describe that for me? How?
Well, there are a lot of love languages, aren't there?
Yes.
Aren't there, how many, 5 basic ones or something like that? You show it by being with them. You show it by telling them. You show them by giving them gifts of time or physical gifts. You show it by, as I said, by telling them. You show it by hugging them. I'm trying to think of all the different love languages. I can't get them all to somebody. But, you know, normally it's not hard. In fact, it's fun. Although sometimes you have to remember, you know, birthdays. I can't remember the birthdays of all my grandchildren. But my wife keeps a record.
There's a light reception in the lobby here. You're welcome. You're all welcome to join us. Thank you, Professor Vitz.
Okay.